Imagine an artist whose songs hit #1 on the Billboard charts. Like someone who is utterly idolized by Bob Dylan.
Right.
But now, imagine that same artist living much of his adult life in this tin-roofed shack with absolutely no plumbing. Imagine someone who once traded the publishing rights to his first 4 albums for a mere $20 just to buy heroin.
Yeah, it's wild.
And perhaps most tragically, imagine a legendary storyteller who had almost no memory of his own childhood.
You're really looking at a life that just defies every conventional narrative of success. We're talking about Townsend Zandt. And for those of you who love music, you know he is the ultimate songwriter, the architect of classics like Poncho and Lefty.
Absolutely.
Our mission for this deep dive is to explore that massive tension between his undeniable poetic genius and the crushing addiction and mental illness that plagued him. We want to unpack why his legacy quietly influences so much of the music you listen to today, and how someone so allergic to the music industry ended up, conquering it anyway.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because to truly understand the sheer tragedy of his later years, you first have to look at how incredibly bright and privileged his beginnings actually were.
Yeah.
It just makes... And the only reason he even asked for that guitar was because he had seen Elvis Presley on TV. He looked at Elvis and figured, that guy had all the money, all the girls, and seemingly all he had to do was stand there and strum an instrument.
The irony there is so thick, it's almost suffocating. Especially considering the absolute squalor Towns would eventually choose to live in later on.
Exactly.
But that guitar was really just the spark. The real derailment, the moment the trajectory of his life permanently shattered, happened a few years later when he enrolled at the University of Colorado.
Right. Things got bad there.
The pressure of his upbringing, combined with what we now understand was untreated mental illness, just began to boil over. He was binge drinking heavily and suffering from these incredibly severe, debilitating episodes of depression.
His parents were terrified, so they flew out to Colorado, pulled him out of school, and brought him back to Texas. They admitted him to a hospital in Galveston, where doctors diagnosed him with manic depression, which, today we would classify as bipolar disorder. And the treatment protocol they authorized is where this story crosses the line from a familiar tale of college burnout into absolute gothic horror.
It really is horrifying. The medical standard for severe manic depression at that specific facility in the 1960s was a procedure called insulin shock therapy. Doctors theorized that by injecting massive doses of insulin, they could purposefully induce a hypoglycemic coma.
Which is just crazy.
Right. The underlying, totally misguided logic was that starving the brain of glucose and forcing a severe physical trauma would somehow reset the brain's chemistry. It was just a brutal physical assault on his nervous system.
They subjected him to 3 months of this, like daily induced comas for 3 months.
And what's fascinating here, and terrifying, honestly, is the sheer psychological devastation that followed. The primary side effect of this now completely discredited treatment was profound retrograde amnesia.
Yeah, that's the part that gets me.
Towns woke up from those 3 months with almost his entire long-term memory totally erased. He had no recollection of his childhood. He couldn't remember the golden boy he was supposed to be.
Wow.
His own mother later confessed that authorizing that treatment was the single biggest regret of her entire life. And on top of that, when he tried to join the Air Force shortly after, the military rejected him outright. They officially labeled him an acute manic depressive.
I can't stop thinking about the mechanics of that memory loss. If his long-term memory was wiped out, did he essentially have to build a completely new identity and emotional history from scratch through his songwriting?
That's a really good point.
It feels like taking a computer, completely wiping the hard drive clean right as the operating system is being installed, and then just expecting it to somehow function and process complex emotional data. It makes total sense that he'd turn to a guitar to figure out who he was, because the person he used to be was simply gone.
That is a phenomenal way to conceptualize it.
Yeah.
He was a blank slate, but a deeply, invisibly traumatized one. So, robbed of his past, and with his meticulously planned legal career demolished, he was completely adrift.
Yeah.
The final tether to his old life snapped when his father died in 1966. That was the real catalyst. Towns abandoned whatever was left of his formal education, hit the road, and decided to submerge himself entirely into music.
So he gravitates toward the Houston club scene, playing places for maybe $10 a night.
Just scraping by.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But he was operating in this incredibly fertile environment, rubbing shoulders with absolute giants of the craft, people like Lightnin' Hopkins and Guy Clark. At first, he's just playing covers, trying to mimic Dylan and Hopkins, until his father's dying encouragement pushes him to write his own material.
And that transition from playing covers to writing original material happens alongside some incredibly strange detours in the Texas music scene.
Okay, which brings up a story from those early Houston days that I have to push back on, because the mechanics of it are utterly baffling to me.
Oh, the Rocky Erickson thing?
Yes. Around 1968, Towns ends up rooming with Roky Erickson, the legendary frontman for the 13th Floor Elevators. The story goes that Erickson convinced Towns to audition as the bass player for the band. But just picture the utter absurdity of this for a second.
It's hilarious.
You have Townes Van Zandt, a guy rapidly developing a reputation for incredibly delicate, intricate acoustic finger-picking. And Roky is asking him to fake playing the bass for a notoriously loud, chaotic, psychedelic rock band.
It makes zero musical sense. Towns had never played a bass guitar in his life. I don't think he even owned one.
Exactly. How long did they think he could fake it? Because apparently, the moment he walked into the audition and the rest of the band realized he didn't even know how to hold the instrument, they threw him out immediately.
Right out the door.
It's this incredibly funny, almost sitcom-level detour in a life that was about to become, well, incredibly heavy.
Yeah, that brevity is probably for the best. Because shortly after that failed audition, he moved to Nashville, which kicks off the most astonishingly prolific era of his life. Between 1968 and 1973, Townes releases 6 full-length albums.
6 albums in 5 years.
Yeah. This is the window where he architects the masterpieces that define his legacy. Songs like To Live Is to Fly and If I Needed You, he cements his status within inner songwriting circles as an absolute phantom genius.
But the brilliance of his art was in direct opposition to the reality of the business. The recording of his music was a complete logistical nightmare. Just look at the debacle surrounding the album that was supposed to be called 7-11.
Oh man, if we connect this to the bigger picture, the 7-11 disaster perfectly illustrates the tragic dynamic of his entire career. You have Van Zandt's raw, poetic talent constantly being grinded down by the cutthroat, frequently incompetent machinery of the music industry. His manager at the time, Kevin Eggers, ended up in a massive financial dispute with the producer, Jack Clement. Eggers either couldn't or wouldn't pay the studio invoice.
So Jack Clement gets so furious about the unpaid bill that he literally erases the master magnetic tapes. He just destroys the recordings of a genius over a studio fee.
Just wipe them clean. The only reason those songs exist today is because Kevin Eggers allegedly sneaked into the studio before the tapes were wiped and recorded rough mixes of the sessions directly onto a cassette tape.
That is insane.
The survival of that music literally hung on a thread of sheer luck and clandestine behavior.
And that kind of chaos wasn't just limited to the recording studio. It completely defined his day-to-day existence. While his myth was growing among his peers in the 1970s, his personal life was plunging into this shockingly dark, self-destructive spiral that really mirrored the heavy melancholia of his lyrics.
He essentially exiled himself. The former golden boy of the Fort Worth elite was now living in a bare-board shack outside of Nashville. It had a tin roof, no heating, no indoor plumbing, and no telephone.
Total isolation.
Exactly. He was completely disconnected from society, only occasionally materializing in town to play a show or record.
And the isolation fed his addictions, which were escalating to terrifying fatal levels. He was drinking so much. His peers witnessed him shooting up heroin, injecting vodka.
Which is just awful to even think about.
I know. The physical toll was unimaginable. He would get so profoundly drunk on stage that he'd forget the lyrics to the very masterpieces he had written. And most horrifyingly, the addiction completely stripped away his boundaries as a parent. He once shot up heroin right in front of his son, JT, who was only 8 years old at the time.
This raises an important question, though. Why are brilliant artists so often consumed by their demons? Are they self-medicating the very sensitivity that allows them to write such profound music?
Right.
His medical records from his numerous failed rehab stints paint a picture of a man in unending psychological agony. Treating doctors consistently noted his effect was blunted, his mood was chronically sad, and he openly admitted to hearing voices, though he poignantly specified to the psychiatrist that they were, quote, mostly musical voices.
The addiction was entirely blinding. It completely erased his ability to advocate for himself. We mentioned this in the beginning, but the details are staggering.
Yeah, they really are.
At one point, his heroin sickness was so intense that he walked up to his manager, Kevin Eggers, and offered the publishing rights to every single song on his first 4 albums for just $20.
$20.
$20 for a fix. Think about the gravity of that for a second. That is essentially trading the deed to a literal gold mine for a single matchstick,
Yeah.
just because you're shivering in that specific moment.
It reveals a complete and utter inability to value his own worth, or to even conceptualize the future. His art was everything when he was creating it, but the business and ownership of his art meant absolutely nothing to him compared to the immediate physical demands of his addiction.
And his personal relationships were just as chaotic and structurally unsound. I mean, he was married 3 times. His second wife, Cindy, was only 15 years old when the 30-year-old Towns met her, though she initially lied about her age.
Right.
Then there was his third wife, Jean. The dynamic there was heavily blurred between romance and management. Around the time they separated, she coaxed him into signing over the publishing rights of his back catalog and his recording royalties entirely to her and their children.
Which practically meant that his only liquid income moving forward was whatever cash he made directly from the door at his live shows.
Wow.
And even then, he was so incapable of managing his life that he would often visit Jean and just empty whatever loose cash he had in his pockets onto her table. He required constant supervision.
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting. Because the need for supervision became so dire that his manager hired his own brother, a guy named Harold Eggers, to step in as Towns's 24-hour caretaker and tour manager.
Yeah, Harold stepped into a role that defied any standard music industry job description.
Right.
Even though Towns was significantly older than Harold, Harold later reflected on the relationship by describing Towns as his first child.
That says so much.
Doesn't it? He was essentially babysitting a profound genius who is actively, daily trying to destroy himself.
And yet, despite all of those active attempts to sabotage himself and his genuine desire to completely avoid the spotlight, massive fame found his songs anyway. The 1980s set up this incredibly sharp, almost cruel contrast to his heartbreaking final days.
The dam finally broke in 1983. Willie Nelson and Merle Haggard covered Poncho and Lefty, and their version shot straight to #1 on the Billboard charts.
Unbelievable.
Suddenly, this reclusive phantom living in a shack without plumbing is the architect of the biggest song in the country.
And the reverence extended far beyond the country establishment. Bob Dylan was notoriously obsessed with Towns's writing. In 1986, Dylan was in Austin, Texas, and he actually requested a meeting.
Yeah, this is a great story.
The city literally cordoned off a street for Dylan. Towns drives his motorhome right into the blocked-off area. Dylan boards the motorhome and just sits there asking Towns to play songs for him.
But Towns had zero interest in leveraging that moment. Dylan reportedly asked him to co-write together on multiple occasions, and Towns repeatedly turned him down.
He just didn't care.
No, he respected Dylan as a peer, but he despised the celebrity machine that surrounded him. He didn't want the fame.
Which makes the industry's attempt to market him so incredibly frustrating. You have the infamous Steve Earle quote, where Earle, who considered Towns his greatest mentor, publicly claimed that Towns was the best songwriter in the world and that he would stand on Bob Dylan's coffee table in his cowboy boots and say it to his face.
It is arguably the most famous quote in the history of alternative country music.
But wait, think about the context here. Even though Steve Earle clearly meant it as the ultimate sign of respect, the record label took that quote and printed it on a massive sticker right on the front of Towns's 1987 album, At My Window.
Oh, yeah.
Wasn't that a fundamental misunderstanding of the man? Towns absolutely hated that quote. He was deeply embarrassed by it. It feels like the executives completely ignored his desire to avoid the celebrity spotlight and weaponized his peers' compliment just to move units.
You are entirely right. It was a loud, aggressive marketing gimmick applied to a man who was existentially allergic to marketing. And as the 1990s rolled around, the physical toll of decades of abuse finally caught up with him. Friends noted that he looked completely withered, like a ghost of a man.
The story of his death is just a relentless cascade of tragedies compressed into a few brutal weeks in late 1996 and early 1997. In mid-December, he fell down a flight of concrete stairs outside his home and severely injured his hip.
But true to form, he flatly refused medical treatment. He lay outside in the dirt for an hour, eventually dragged himself inside, and ended up spending the entire week of Christmas just lying immobilized on a friend's couch. He was unable to even stand up to use the bathroom.
Because he was stubbornly determined to record another album. Steve Shelley from Sonic Youth had reached out to produce him. So Towns actually travels to a studio in Memphis, literally being pushed into the tracking room in a wheelchair by Harold Eggers.
But the sessions are an unmitigated disaster. Towns is far too drunk to perform. His behavior is deeply erratic, and Steve Shelley is forced to pull the plug and cancel the project.
So sad.
Finally, after sitting in agonizing pain on a broken hip for 8 days, Towns concedes and agrees to be hospitalized back in Nashville.
So they take x-rays and discover a massive impacted fracture in his hip. He is immediately taken into surgery to have several pins inserted. But the immediate aftermath of that surgery is where the medical decisions go from negligent to just fatal.
The tragic irony of his death is profound. I mean, he survived decades of the hardest drug abuse imaginable, only to die from complications surrounding a simple fall and incredibly poor decisions made by the people closest to him.
Right.
After the hip surgery, his ex-wife Jean checked him out of the hospital against the desperate, strict warnings of the doctors.
The medical staff practically begged her not to take him. They clearly explained that trying to detox a late-term severe alcoholic at home without constant hospital supervision and intravenous support was incredibly dangerous. But she signed the papers anyway.
And the hospital staff knew he'd likely resume drinking the second he was out of their care, so they refused to prescribe him any post-surgery painkillers. By the time they loaded him into the car the next morning, he was already exhibiting clear signs of delirium tremens.
Which is that severe hallucinatory alcohol withdrawal that can easily trigger a fatal heart attack.
Exactly.
So to supposedly ward off the delirium tremens, Jean gave him a flask of vodka in the car. Once they got him back to the house, a friend shared a marijuana joint with him, and he was given Tylenol PM to help him sleep through the pain of the unmedicated hip surgery.
It was an absolute recipe for physiological disaster. His battered system simply couldn't process the shock of the surgery, the severe alcohol withdrawal, and that makeshift cocktail of depressants.
Later that morning, on New Year's Day, 1997, their son Will walked into the room and noticed that Towns had stopped breathing. Gina frantically attempted CPR, screaming his name, but the damage was done. Towns Van Zandt died of a cardiac arrhythmia at the age of 52.
It was a completely preventable end that snuffed out one of the most vital, singular literary voices in the history of American music.
Take a breath, because the immediate aftermath of his death was just as tangled and chaotic as the life he lived. The messy threads of his art and his business immediately unraveled. Ugly, vicious legal battles broke out almost the day he died.
Oh yeah, the lawsuits were endless.
His former manager, Kevin Eggers, went on to release 14 unauthorized albums without the family's consent, claiming a 50% ownership interest in 80 of his songs. It took nearly 10 years of grueling court battles for Towns' estate to finally win back control of the catalog.
And it was through the discovery process of those very court proceedings that a truly shocking detail emerged.
This part blew my mind.
Despite living in a shack without heat, and despite looking and dressing like a destitute hobo for his entire adult life, his song royalties from major covers were quietly accumulating. His annual income had secretly climbed to over $100,000 a year in the period just before he died.
He had money. He just fundamentally did not care about it. The material world meant nothing to him. And since his passing, his music has only grown in cultural stature. You hear his haunting voice everywhere now.
Everywhere.
His songs anchor iconic scenes in movies like The Big Lebowski and hit shows like Breaking Bad. He's been covered by artists across the entire spectrum, from Norah Jones and the Yvette Brothers to avant-garde metal bands like Neurosis.
His influence is completely unbound by genre because the emotional truth of his writing is universal.
So what does this all mean when we look at the totality of this incredibly complex, painful life? What is the takeaway for you?
Towns Van Zandt represents the absolute rawest form of art. He was a man who lived entirely for the sake of the song. He was utterly, tragically incapable of navigating the real world, the cutthroat business, the interpersonal relationships, even the basic maintenance of his own physical health. But because of that complete destructive surrender to his muse, he left behind a bulletproof catalog of music. It is profound beauty born directly from immense, unrelenting suffering.
It leaves you with such a heavy, haunting thing to ponder. We talked earlier about his mother saying her single biggest regret was allowing that insulin shock therapy in college, the therapy that wiped his memory clean. But you have to wonder if that therapy hadn't erased his past, if it hadn't destroyed the golden boy, pre-law student he used to be. Would the world have ever received the poetic genius of Towns Van Zandt? Can profound beauty only be built on the ruins of something lost?